In order to understand the meaning of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and of the fall of man, we must first provide an overview of the ontology we're working with, as the fall was an ontological event, not merely an ethical one. Our ontology goes by many names: Eucharistic, relational, incarnational, but my preferred term is the communal ontology. The general idea of the communal ontology is accepted by essentially every Orthodox Christian theologian, and this general idea is that being is communion. This principle, like every principle, is grounded in God Himself, who exists not as a unipersonal monad, but as Trinity, as the communion between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Communion involves the movement toward the other and the other's reciprocal movement back, so that there's a mutual indwelling. This movement of procession towards and reversion back is being itself, and the archetype of being is the Trinity as the perfect communion between the three divine persons. Being is motion. It's constituted by the movement toward the other and the other's movement back. In the context of creatures, their being consists of their movement towards their telos, which is God. This movement is made possible by God who works in us. This idea is developed in the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor. To quote Joseph P. Farrell's book, God, History, and Dialectic, "Because the world was created from nothing," says St. Maximus, "it had a definite beginning, or genesis. But its genesis, its creation, if analyzed metaphysically, marked a passage from non-being into being. Thus, the very essence or being of creation was precisely becoming. Because becoming was the very essence of its being, the natural operation or natural energy of creation was to move. All creatures, man included, had a proper natural motion or kinesis. The being of beings is their movement towards God. The movement away from God, i.e. sin, is a movement towards nothing at all. Since God is the source of all being and life, to move away from Him is to die." With this established, we can now discuss the meaning of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the fall of man. Now, as I mentioned before, the fall should not be understood as primarily a moral event. Rather, it was an ontological event, a break of communion between man and God. According to the Orthodox theologian and philosopher Christos Yannaras, good and evil in the early chapters of Genesis don't refer to moral categories, but to life and death. In Genesis chapter 2, God gives Adam all of creation as a blessing, along with the task of cultivating and maturing it. Trees that are pleasing to the eye and good for food are mentioned explicitly as gifts that God gives to man. However, after giving Adam creation as a gift, God gives him a commandment. "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." According to Yannaras, this shouldn't be interpreted as primarily an ethical commandment, but as a warning. Man's mode of relation to God isn't primarily ethical or intellectual, as both morality and knowledge are downstream from the existential relation between man and God. This relation is one of communion, which is why Genesis uses the symbolism of food. God offers man every fruit of the earth, offers it to him as food, and his offering is blessing. The food constitutes the mode by which man is kept in existence, the mode by which man exists, and this mode is blessing. That is to say, it creates a relationship between man and God. Think about what eating is. When we eat, we take food into us, and it gives us the energy necessary for life. When we partake of the Eucharist, we eat God Himself. This is how He indwells in us. While it may be contrary to our modern sensibilities to say that God would dwell in us through an act as vulgar as eating, all this shows is that God does things differently than us. And there is a very consistent and rich theology of food in the Bible. For example, it's clear that Jesus is the new tree of life, which is why the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, is the tree of life. When we partake of the Eucharist, we do what Adam and Eve were meant to do in the garden. To quote Seraphim Hamilton, "Adam was meant to lead his wife to the tree of life, where God planned to appear to them, instruct them what to do for the next week, and eat with them. They would partake of the tree of life. On their way to the tree, they came across the tree of knowledge, which God had told Adam was off limits." Seraphim goes on to describe how the serpent tempts Eve and how Adam allows it to happen. He then goes on to say, "But then a booming sound is heard. The garden lights up. God has appeared in His glory for their Sabbath meal. But Adam isn't at the tree of life where he was supposed to be. Hearing the deafening noise and seeing the garden light up, Adam and Eve hide among the trees. God arrives, having intended to bless them on the day of the Lord. He expects them and sees, not good. They are cursed. The Sabbath has arrived. God has descended to eat with his children, and his children didn't show up for the meal. So the meal doesn't happen. The tree of life is blocked off. God's expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and the curse of death shouldn't be seen as some arbitrary act of divine wrath. In the East, this has traditionally been understood as an act of mercy. One way this can be understood is by seeing death as a guarantee that humanity won't exist in its fallen state forever, which ultimately points toward Christ, who takes death and uses it as the very means by which humanity is redeemed. Another way we can understand this is by taking into consideration the biblical teaching that communion with God is dangerous for those who are unworthy. This unworthiness isn't ethical, but ontological. It has to do with God's very mode of being. God's mode of being is not only distinct from that of sin, but it actually destroys it. This is why Paul speaks of the Eucharist as a great danger for those who are unworthy. And in the Divine Liturgy, we describe the Eucharist as the holy things for the holy. This answers the problem of divine hiddenness. God doesn't reveal himself to most of us because we're unprepared. His presence would be a danger to us. God is light, and by his very nature, he reveals what is hidden. That's why Christ says that in the end, when God is all in all that is hidden shall be revealed. God's mode of being is one of communion and revelation. Both of these are implied by the other. The love of the Father and the Son is revealed through the Spirit who's brought into this communion of love. But now think about a time when something was revealed about yourself that you didn't want to be revealed. You probably felt a sense of shame and embarrassment. It may have even been a traumatic experience. By the very nature of who and what God is, his presence reveals everything hidden, every single one of our imperfections, and we're forced to confront them. And this is why God reveals himself gradually and in proportion to what we can handle. Any sense of self-relation or autonomy we may have is destroyed by God's presence, who reveals every secret we hide and our absolute dependence upon him. Any fiction of self-autonomy that we may have, God reveals as false. When Adam and Eve chose to eat of the tree of knowledge, they chose to enter into an autonomous mode of being, one that's not constituted by relation with God, but by self-relation. In the first episode of the Baptizing Philosophy podcast, James Cortides and I talked about how the fall relates to Jacques Lacan's notion of the imaginary and the ego as an imaginary construct. The ego as the self-autonomous I is imaginary. It has no true being, and when we direct our activities in service of it through sin, primarily that of pride, we move out of the realm of infinite being and into the realm of finitude, which ultimately ends in death. A reception of food that does not constitute a relationship with God is possible. It lies within the free choice of human beings, and it constitutes the existential autonomy of the creature. But an existence that makes itself independent of the cause of the existential event without an existential relationship with the mode of self-causation and achronicity has chosen the mode of finitude, that is to say, mortality. Before the fall, Adam and Eve didn't possess knowledge of good and evil, as both of these are experiential realities. Goodness refers to the experience of relation, while evil refers to the experience of non-relation or self-relation. Yannaras points out that even God's commandment to Adam didn't explain why eating of the tree of knowledge would result in death. God simply presents it as information. God's warning about the eating that signifies death doesn't offer any knowledge. It simply presents information without anything empirical corresponding to it. The warning could have elicited man's faith or trust in the love that warns him. Trust could have replaced immediate experiential knowledge as experience of relation. So long as good means life without limit and evil means existential finitude and death, the knowledge of good and evil can only be experiential, can only be ascertained in actual experience. In disobeying God, Adam and Eve gained the knowledge of good and evil, and in this very moment, they became conscious of their own evil. Again, by evil we mean self-autonomy. So Adam and Eve became conscious of their self-autonomy. This is the formation of the ego. The crucial point is that the consciousness of self-autonomy is the very substance of self-autonomy, which is why it's purely a subjective fiction, but one that's nonetheless a reality for those who experience it. Self-autonomy is imaginary. It's not true, but it takes on a life of its own through the fallen, sinful will. This is one of the main themes of the preface to my book Aphasis, in which I write, "The fall is precisely a fall into non-being, the not true, the subjective. We may conceptualize paradise as the objective immediacy of man and God in mutual understanding, while the fall was the shattering of the harmonious whole into disharmonious wholes." The fall was a fall into self. This is the origin of the individual that's divided from the other. After gaining the knowledge of their imaginary self-autonomy, Adam and Eve were divided from each other. According to Yannaras, the shame they experienced was the result of the gaze of the other. Under the gaze of the other, I experienced my reduction to an undifferentiated physical individual. The danger that I should not be a subject, but only a neutral object. The sense of this danger is the sense of nakedness, and the defense against the danger is shame. Human beings have an instinctive need to preserve their subjectivity. The objectification that is imposed by the gaze of the other constitutes an existential threat. The other undermines the ego's claim to self-autonomy and self-determination, and its gaze reduces it to a mere object that can be used. This is why Adam and Eve make themselves garments to cover their nakedness. I therefore dress in order to protect myself from the threat of existing as an object, the threat of having my subjectivity, my rational existential otherness, negated. I dress in order to be able to see without being seen, to define my subjectivity, not to be defined without who I am, simply as a thing. I dress in order to preserve the possibility of relation, of that which constitutes me as a rational subject. I dress in order not to exist solely for use. As opposed to being robed in glory through communion with God, Adam and Eve covered themselves due to the psychological consequences of their attempt to live without him. As we've already discussed, the way of existence they chose ultimately ends in death. The fall taken to its furthest conclusion is the abyss of hell itself. The only way to exit this descent into hell is by abandoning one's sense of self-autonomy through faith. Faith is the precondition of communion, as it's the first step in our self-renunciation, in which we cease to consider our finite and fallen ego as the ultimate measure of truth. Through faith, we begin to live in the mode of relation, the only true mode of being, and one that finds its fulfillment in the infinite joy of communion with God.